Ladies and gentlemen, this RedGaming.com video, I'm going to discuss an article that's doing the rounds at the moment. It's featured on TechSpot.com. And it effectively is discussing the fact that the Xbox One's struggles are traceable to a single bad decision. That's the headline, that's the grabber. And effectively, it is asserting that the Xbox One's sales figures are lower than the PlayStation 4's because customers are looking at the power of the machines. Primarily, the article citing the fact of the use of DDR3/ESRAM on the console, and the PlayStation 4 of course doesn't have that, and it's basically saying that for many consumers they associate the PlayStation 4 to be better value for money simply because the graphics are better. Now, this article is getting quite a bit of traction and being discussed quite a bit, NeoGAF for example, and I figure I'll give my few pennies into this one, because although I agree with some aspects of the article, quite frankly I highly disagree with others. So I'm going to read out a few choice parts of this article. I will provide the link in the description. So we're going to start out by pointing out the main factors of the article. The first is the fact that there is of course a $50 price drop for the Xbox One, which is going to take effect from the 2nd of November to the 2nd of January. As I said, that's going to be $50 off of the retail price, bringing the entry-level machine in the United States to $350, which is cheaper than the PlayStation 4. Now, the article does assert the fact that this is not going to be temporary. They believe that Microsoft are going to continue this, and they are citing Ars Technica and estimating that the PS4 is outselling the X1 by about 40%, maybe slightly more, maybe slightly less. And then they go into a variety of different other reasons for the Xbox One, and then say these aren't the problems. They say it wasn't the DRM policies, it wasn't the online requirements, it wasn't even Kinect. Though the $100 premium was a bit of a problem. It then goes to say that it was because of the 8GB of DDR3 memory running at 2133 MHz, as well as the 32MB of ESRAM. While Sony, of course, opted for 8GB of 5500 MHz GDDR5, they're both running, of course, on a 256-bit memory bus, just so that we get that out of the way. That of course provides 68GB per second using DDR3 versus about 176GB per second with the GDDR5, therefore that's what the ESRAM's for. So the major bottom line here of course is the fact that the ESRAM is to try and make up for the bandwidth gulf that the DDR3 provides. So this is probably the main part of the article. You've got two choices. One costs $400 and has better graphics. The other costs $500 with extra hardware you may want but don't need, exclusives or a wash. Which would you choose? Two choices. Both cost $400. One has better graphics. Exclusives are still mostly a wash. Which would you choose? Most gamers would choose the machine with the better graphics. Now, I do agree with this next point. Xbox fans will argue the visual differences are imperceivable. That may be the case, but not really the point. Perception is reality, and perception is the PlayStation 4 is more powerful than Xbox One. In other words, because it's perceived to be more powerful, more people are more likely to buy it. And they also say the problem goes deeper for the Microsoft. Let's say you purchase both consoles, for example myself. A big third-party game like AC comes out on both, and the PS4 version runs at high resolution. Do you get the PS4 version or do you get the Xbox One? Most people buy the PS4 version. The game's publisher sees the PlayStation 4 version sold better and concludes that they should put more resources into the winning platform. Those resources translate to better games, which give more customers even more reasons to choose the Sony machine, and Microsoft earns less revenue to make up for the lost leader, the console itself. They then go on to point out that the weaker console is not necessarily always the loser. Obviously you can cite the Wii, you can cite the Sega Genesis even, compared to the Super Nintendo. Hell, to be totally honest, you could even cite the PlayStation 2 versus the original Xbox and the GameCube. The original GameCube absolutely kicks the ass of the PlayStation 2, and the Xbox One, and the original Xbox, about to say the Xbox One, murders it even further. But the PlayStation 2 was quite single-handedly the winner. So the problem is that Xbox One isn't much cheaper to manufacture than the PS4. There was research done from the firm IHS estimated the cost of the consoles, and the problem is the APU. It's not anything else. It's the fact that because you've got the ESRAM on the Xbox One's die, it basically means that it's costing them a hell of a lot of cash. And so, because of basically the fact that you've got the ESRAM as well, it's basically taken away some of the space from the GPU components, and effectively you've got less compute units, and you've also got fewer ROPs. And so because of that, you've got a weaker GPU, and you've got less memory bandwidth available, and therefore you've got to go the ESRAM, and therefore that's what's caused this whole resolution gate scandal, and therefore the article asserts that's the reason that the PS4 is selling better. However, now we've gone into the article itself, I personally don't 100% agree with it. I do agree that the resolution issue is a problem, but I also believe that there's a couple of other things we have to factor in when it comes to consoles. I personally just think it's ludicrous to state that the DRM policies of Microsoft didn't hurt the console. Because here was the thing, for many, we were watching this news, I was, and of course I was reporting it, but many of you were the same way, even websites were just looking at this news. The Xbox One is possibly going to be DRM. The Xbox One is most likely going to be DRM, in other words, always online connection, and blah blah blah. And we were just looking at this thing like, they're not going to do it. It can't. I didn't even release a devil's advocate video back then, and I said, look, here are the reasons that they might want to do it. Here are the reasons not. And I did say at the time, one possible good thing is it could theoretically reduce the price of the games, because theoretically used games won't become a thing. However, the backlash was just ridiculous, and then they announced it, and all of us just were like, are you serious? Everyone commented on it. Even people who are primarily PC gamers were just pissed. It was absolutely ridiculous. And of course, they went back on it. But it gave Sony so much leg room for Microsoft. They basically used the whole, here's how to trade a disc. It wasn't good. Another reason, when you think about it, Sony at this point are associated with gaming. The PlayStation 3, in my opinion, was more of an anomaly than any of the other PlayStations, because the PlayStation 3 was the only system where it wasn't the absolute clear dominant winner. The PlayStation, the original PlayStation, the PSX, when it went against the Saturn, I would argue that Sega could probably have pulled out of this Death Spire if they hadn't have screwed up every single bloody time. I mean, it's only now that I'm older I realise how many dumb decisions Sega made at the time versus the original PlayStation. There was the whole quad issue that, of course, was the whole Saturn's geometry. But, yeah, okay, for 3D, the PlayStation definitely was a better machine. For 2D, the Saturn definitely won, hands down. But the fact of the matter is, with better SDKs and so on, the Saturn was capable of doing some of this stuff anyway. It's just that the dumb decisions that Sega continued to make, and then the poor support of the Saturn towards the end of its life, because they just didn't think it was going too well, so they kind of started to pull the plug. And of course the other issues with Sega when they started to basically effectively diminish their own markets by no longer supporting the Genesis and all of these other legacy systems. They basically shot themselves in the foot. Nintendo also hurt themselves as well with the whole cartridge situation with the N64. People quite simply put, well, they looked at the price of the bloody cartridges. In some cases, they were like £70, £80 in the UK, especially when the system was first launched. People were price gouging ridiculous amounts. And on top of that, you had Squaresoft, who were pissed, to be totally honest, that they weren't supporting a CD format, and they wanted to release games like Final Fantasy, which had so much cutscenes in them, and already using like 3 discs on FF7 on the PlayStation's, you know, initial offering, really. And you can see that the PlayStation basically just won, and since then the PS2 did the same thing. It rabbit punched Sega. The Dreamcast had a really good launch, but Sony just had this like media freight train going. I would argue as well, it's a real shame. Sega did the same thing though. They screwed up the joypad, in my personal opinion. Everyone loved the pad of the Saturn, and then they basically butchered it for the Dreamcast. The controls, it just felt very uncomfortable in the hands. It's not just my opinion, quite a few people. But I would argue the original Xbox and the GameCube were very good systems. I just don't think at that point, you know, Microsoft had just entered into the competition. They didn't really know what to expect, blah blah blah, but they did do quite a lot of good. I do think Microsoft made a pretty good initial offering. Nintendo, same problem. They had some, to be totally and utterly honest, they had some issues when it came to marketing, like the delay, for example, for a Mario title was quite ludicrous. And then, of course, you had Luigi's Mansion, but many people didn't want that. I personally believe that if they'd have launched with a good Mario selection and so on, they probably would have done a bit better. But the console's cheap initial offering also helped. When the Xbox 360 was launched, and of course I'm abbreviating history quite considerably here, when the PlayStation 3 launched compared to the Xbox 360, many people just didn't want to bloody buy the thing. I know a couple of people that really wanted the PS3, but they just said, no, it's too expensive. Just no, it's just far too expensive. And they just went with the 360. Yes, technically the 360 had some issues. For example, it didn't have DVD and it had some failure rate issues, but many people just couldn't afford the PS3 on launch or just didn't want to spend that amount of money. The PlayStation 3 also had an inferior online service, particularly at the start, when Microsoft pretty much nailed it to begin with and the PlayStation version just felt like a poor imitation. They definitely improved things, however, towards the end. They had SDK issues, the system was bloody hard to program for, so technically at the start games looked awful. And there were just other issues as well with the system. But you know what? They did really well. And Microsoft, on the other hand, while Sony was starting to secure a lot of really good first-party titles, there just wasn't really that many games for the Xbox 360 the last couple of years. And this is something that even like die-hard Xbox fans have said. It's like, yeah, you've got like Minecraft, which was pretty exclusive to start with. You had Halo 4, you had a couple of others, but a lot of titles, it was just like, well, yeah, I'm waiting. Like, I know I've got a friend that's a massive Gears of War fan, and you know, I think it was Judgment was the last one. I don't really play Gears anymore. I think it was Judgment, but anyway, he said, yeah, it was okay. It was pretty good, but it was a bit disappointing compared to the other Gears of War, and it's the same thing for like Halo fans as well. And I think that was an issue. So there was weak customer loyalty there. I wouldn't say it was awful, and people still loved the Xbox 360, and still some versions of the 360 games were the best, but there you have it. The other problem I do think that Microsoft had was the whole TV situation. The TV situation definitely hurt them. That initial E3, I think they have pulled out of it to begin with quite a bit, to be honest. And so that's another major factor, to be totally blunt. I think it's fair to say that Microsoft got really taken aback by the PlayStation 4. They didn't expect the specs that Sony had, and the whole reason, just of course so we're all on the same page, the GDDR5 memory wasn't used by Microsoft. If they were concerned, quite simply, they wouldn't get enough of it. They knew they needed 8 GB of RAM because of all the media features that the Xbox One was going to have, as well as the OS reserve, and they were just basically saying, hey, you know what, we're not really confident about this, and that's why they went with it, which was a gamble. Basically, it could have really paid off for them, or it could have worked out how it did. As it turns out, we know that even the PlayStation 4 was going to have 4 gigs for quite some time, and it was only basically at the last minute that Sony was like, yep, we're not going to be putting in a camera or any of this type of stuff. We're going to keep the system as cheap as possible because we're going to be putting in 8 gigs of RAM. And from what I understand, and from what's been uttered behind closed doors, so to speak, and kind of made its way out, developers themselves, unless they were like really close to Sony, like first party studios, but even they weren't 100% sure that Sony were going to be going with 8 gigs. And so, you know, we could have had a situation where Sony only managed to squeeze 4 in their system, Microsoft had 8, and even if you count OS reserves, let's say Microsoft had reserved, say, 2 gigs of RAM, I personally, if I were Microsoft, I would have gotten that reserve down as bloody low as possible, because then you would have had a situation where potentially you could have had like 6.5 gigs of RAM available, and obviously the PlayStation 4 still got to have an OS reserve, so let's say that's 512, so you could have had like potentially 6.5 versus say 3.5 gigs. That would have been very interesting, particularly for open world cross-platform titles. But anyway, that's beside the point. So now I think the perceived quality and perceived value are definitely a big thing when it comes to product specifications, and I do think this is a bigger issue, however, for people who own both systems. Like if you've got both, I don't know the percentage of people who own both systems. I'd be quite interested to know that. But then it comes down to multiple things. Which version is the superior version? And of course there are multiple things which come to superiority. It can be the DLC, it can be the controls. Do you like their PlayStation 4 controller? Do you? Well, if you do, then, you know, fine. On the other hand, you might not like the PlayStation 4 controller, you might prefer the Xbox controller, you might prefer the PlayStation 4 controller to the Xbox, whatever. It's also down to, well, who are you playing with? If you don't know anyone that's buying the Xbox One version, you know, people that buy the PlayStation 4 version, or vice versa, that's also going to contribute to your decision, surely. I realise this is getting a bit out of topic, but I don't think you can boil down the decision to buy a system down just to purely the choice of memory. Do I think Microsoft made a bad decision? Yes. I think that they should not have done what they did. I honestly believe that, but they can't undo it. However, what they can do is have a really good games lineup, and that, at this point, is going to be the contributing factor, or even, I would not even say contributing factor, I'd say that's the deciding factor to getting people to buy the machine. I know several people who own an Xbox One. I don't know anyone, even though they know the machine is technically inferior to the PlayStation 4, and I know people who own both machines, I know people that own a PS4, and I know people that own an Xbox One. And I don't know anyone that says, huh, damn, I wish I bought a PlayStation 4 because it's got me a few extra pixels on screen. Now, I will argue that people do say, that people I know, and judging by forums and comments and just discussions I've had with viewers and readers and stuff like that, they will argue it. They do say it sucks that our version is running at a slightly lower frame rate or whatever, but I don't think it's going to be the deciding factor for a console war. Because the problem is, if you want to go with that pure logic, buy a PC. Because if you're solely basing your decision on whether to buy a system on value and performance, the PC wins. And I know that's going to sound a very PC gaming master race, and yes, I am more of a PC gamer, but it's true. You can buy a pretty cheap gaming PC now of like $750 US that's going to massively outperform a PlayStation 4 or an Xbox One. And you can certainly go cheaper, particularly if you're willing to scout around a little bit, use rebates, that type of thing. You can easily make the system considerably cheaper, and with that's assuming you need to buy everything as well. We're talking right down to the case, the power supply, even the optical drive. So if you've already got some components, you can definitely make it cheaper, and components are getting cheaper as well with recent price cuts to a lot of the GPUs out there, especially the mid-range. I'm actually quoting prices of about 6 months ago for those prices. You might even be able to get something considerably better now. The Xbox One does have problems, but aside from the performance issues, I don't think any of them are anything that Microsoft cannot resolve. I truly believe that they can easily win out in the next generation. I'm not saying they will beat Sony, but they can definitely win the hearts and minds of gamers, and I don't think it's going to be like this one-horse race. The problem is, as well, from a very brutal, blunt, harsh reality, Microsoft have more money than Sony. stability-wise, as a company, Microsoft are not going anywhere. Sure, they could make the decision to pull the plug on the Xbox division, but it's very unlikely they're going to do that. Very unlikely, especially this early in the generation, because it's just going to kill a lot of customer confidence with Microsoft products as a whole. It's not going to happen. So you're going to have Microsoft really pushing it. And bottom line is, they've got the money. They can buy, to be totally blunt, they can buy studios if they really have to. They can afford to make titles exclusive. They can do it. They have the reserves of cash to basically do whatever the hell they want. And so I don't really worry that Microsoft are going to say, oh, you know what, we're worried. Hey, if they have to, they can buy the bloody rights and just say, hey, we'll partially fund the sodding title on our system. I will argue there's some definitely problems with the Xbox in terms of like the way for games for gold, I'm sorry, if I can bloody well pronounce it, works. I think it should be easier to find the titles. I think they're a little bit hidden. I think that the overall interface of the Xbox One Dash still needs a little bit of work. I still don't think it's quite as good as it should be. But overall, I think the system works quite well. I even quite like the tiled interface. Same with the PlayStation 4. I don't have any real problems with the PS4. I think it's a natural evolution of the PS3's GUI, to be totally honest. So, to sum up my thoughts and opinions on this, was it one decision that won the hearts and mind of gamers? Not really, in my personal opinion. I think that the performance is definitely a factor. It really is, because at the end of the day, gamers are bombarded by it, and one can argue it's the forum dwellers, the really hardcore gamers that know this stuff. But the problem is, most people at this point are aware of Resolution Gate. I know people that aren't technically interested in consoles that much, that what they do is play games, but they know roughly that the PS4 is more powerful. They don't know really the details. They might not even know what a GPU is, and that's a problem in and of itself. But they do know that they know that the Xbox One has worse memory bandwidth, but they don't know what that means necessarily. They do know, however, that 900p is lower than 1080p. Is it going to be enough to dissuade them? My opinion, probably not. It's going to be the whole situation. So I don't think this is like a massive big deal that the article makes it out to be, because I think Microsoft did make several screw-ups that I believe for the most part they've remedied, but obviously it made them hobble out of the gate, quite frankly. Then there was even the whole privacy concerns with the Xbox One, and as I said in another video, that to a degree wasn't even Microsoft's fault. Some of it just happened to coincide when basically everyone was talking about the NSA spying and everything. It just so happened that, you know, the whole Skype concerns came up at the same time, and then people reading through the Xbox's EULA and so on and so on, and then basically Microsoft were on a back foot of everything. And then you've got even some of their own employees, like the whole hashtag deal with it situation. I mean, that was terrible. And then you had, of course, Don Matrick constantly screwing things up. I think it's a gross oversimplification to say that this is hardware related only, personally. And I do honestly believe that the current Xbox management is doing a much better job. And I truly believe this console generation, no matter which system you buy, and I'd even extend this to the Wii U as well, I truly believe no matter which system you buy, you are not going to be disappointed. Unless you just don't like the games that are released on either system right now, which is fair enough. It's arguable that if you look at it from a brutal perspective, there's not that many console exclusives on either machine which are like, oh my god, I must buy this. But obviously by the end of Christmas, and certainly rolling into the next, I don't think you're going to regret your decision. I think if you bought the Xbox One, you're going to be extremely happy with the Halo collection. You're going to be loving, most likely, from what I'm hearing, the new Gears of War is going to be amazing. It's going to be more back to the old original formula. I was a massive fan of the original Gears, I have to say. Not necessarily just from the online side of things, but the storyline itself, like the co-op, I loved it. I thought it was astounding. I think we're going to be getting really awesome titles. I think the Master Chief Collection is going to be good. I think the new Halo is going to be good. I think Sunset Overdrive's looking good from what I've heard. Amata, she's been playing it a little bit. I think the PlayStation 4 is going to be also astounding. We've already had some good titles released on it, of course, but we're going to be having like the Order 1886, Bloodborne. All of those games just look amazing in and of itself, and of course we know we're going to be having like new titles from like Naughty Dog, Uncharted and so on. And even the Wii U is starting to really hit its stride now. I know a couple of people with Wii U, I don't know that many people, but now even I'm considering getting a Wii U. It's really starting to take off. You know, you've got Smash Bros, which just looks amazingly fun, to be totally and utterly blunt. It's also doing pretty well in the FGC side of things. A lot of fighting game fans are starting to really love it. You've got even some original release titles, which were kind of hidden gems, like Zombie U, which really, to be honest, deserved to do better than what it did. But it was just kind of how it was. And of course you've got like Zelda Hyrule Warriors and new Marios and all these titles which are coming out. So I don't really think that, you know, there's going to be a perceived lack of quality on either system. I do think that Microsoft did make a mistake with the performance. I think they should have made the hardware better than what it was, but they didn't. It is what it is. I don't think it's going to doom the system. That's just my personal opinion. I realise this video has become far lengthier than what it was supposed to be, but that's how I roll. Anyway, guys, hopefully you found it somewhat interesting. Give me your thoughts, give me your opinions. I shall look forward to them, possibly. Anyway, I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.